Welcome to Crash Course, where today we'll be talking about the race to outer space. I'm Olivia. Let's find out what happened.
The 1900s were filled with lots of new inventions. The vacuum cleaner, the air conditioner radio, and even the electric washer were introduced, but none were as exciting as sending someone to space and eventually the moon. By the 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing, affecting the economic and political platforms of both the US and the Soviet Union.
The space race was a 20th century competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, where both fought for dominance in spaceflight capability. The space race began after the US and the Soviets became enemies after World War II. It occurred during the Cold War, where there was political conflict, proxy wars, military tensions, and economic competition. The space race was the most known event in the Cold War, and it created technology that's vital to the world today.
Leading up to the space race was lots of innovation in the science of rockets and space. First, if there was the question if we could do it, and then how. During the mid-1700s, Hyder Lee manufactured the first rocket made of iron to improve the stability as it launched as well as its range after launch. And in 1926, Robert Goddard successfully launched the first ever liquid-fueled rocket. This led to many more successful launches and discoveries, like in 1929, when Robert Goddard launched another rocket with tools inside to collect data for future tests. And in 1930, Pluto was discovered by Clyde Tombaugh. In 1942, Germany launched its first ever A-4 missile. And in 1945, America brought together a group of rocket scientists in Texas to begin its work in the space race. In 1947, a pilot in an X-1 broke the sound barrier for the first time ever, and in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite known as Sputnik. This led to the beginning of the space race.
Let's get to what actually happened during the space race. The US announced that they are going to launch artificial satellites for the International Geophysical Year, which marked a long period during the Cold War where the scientific interchange between the East and West had been interrupted. The space race officially began on August 2nd in 1955 when the Soviet Union replied to the US by declaring that they would also launch a satellite in the near future. In 1957, the Soviet Union beat the US with officially launching Sputnik. In 1961, the Soviets beat the US once again and sent the first human to space. Finally, in 1969, the US landed the first human on the moon with Apollo 11. After a couple of years, there is an agreement on a cooperative Apollo-Soyuz test project where the US and the Soviet Union teamed up and made the first joint space flight. This pretty much ended the space race.
Dwight D. Eisenhower was a U.S. Army general and served as the 34th President of the U.S. and was President during the first part of the space race. During this time, he said, "There are many aspects of space and space technology which can be helpful to all people as the United States proceeds with its peaceful program in space, science, and exploration. Every person has the opportunity to share through understanding in what adventures lie ahead." Dwight D. Eisenhower. When the space race officially started, the U.S. had everything they needed to make it to space and be the first ones in outer space. This would have happened if Eisenhower gave permission for Jupiter-C rocket to launch, but he didn't because he was concerned about using military missiles and feared people would call him names. But they approved the space mission in 1955.
Anyways, by 1957, after the Soviets beat the US to launch the first satellite into space, the US was embarrassed and quickly attempted to launch one, but failed. The Americans eventually successfully launched the Explorer 1, but quickly lost all their confidence and believed all the Soviets would be the first to launch an actual human being into space.
The US was, of course, correct, but shortly after the Soviets, they also successfully launched a human into space. After the Soviets launched yet another person into space, John F. Kennedy announced that the US was going to send a man to the moon. This race to the moon redefined space exploration considerably. the U.S. began to work on Project Gemini, which would surpass the Soviets' lead in the space race. By 1969, America had a plan to send a man to the moon. Then, on July 11th, Neil Armstrong was the first person to set foot on the moon. His infamous quote was viewed by over 500 million TV viewers around the world. That's one small step for man, one huge leap for mankind. America had won the space race.
Now let's get to the Soviets' point of view in the space race. Up until the end of the space race, the Soviets were leading it.
Before Sputnik 1, Sergei Korolev, also known as the father of practical astronomics and also the Soviets' lead engineer, created Object D, a failed satellite. He was involved in making the Sputnik 1 and launching Laika, the first dog, and the first human, into space. Korolev talks about the space race and says, "The time will come when a spacecraft carrying human beings will leave the Earth and set out on a voyage to distant planets, to remote worlds. Today, this may seem only an enticing fantasy, but such in fact is not the case. The launching of the first two Soviet Sputniks has already thrown a sturdy bridge from Earth into space, and the way to the stars is open." Korolev.
October 4th, 1957, the Soviets became the first to launch a satellite into Earth's orbit, which gave them a huge lead in the space race since the US had already said they were going to be the first to do it. Then, on April 12, 1961, the Soviets once again beat the US and put the first human being into space. This wasn't only a great triumph for the USSR, but also for the entire world.
The Soviets continued to lead in the space race and became the first to do many things, including conducting a dual-piloted flight, sending a woman to space, conducting a multi-person flight, and more. Then, things turned for the worse for the Soviets when John F. Kennedy announced the race to the moon. During the race to the moon, the U.S. kept succeeding, and the Soviets kept failing. They attempted 4 times to launch a rocket that would reach the moon, but each time they failed. Then, after America's second successful land to the moon, the Soviets' moon program was canceled. Though the U.S. had won the space race, the USSR's achievements in technology they used were the origins of space exploration today. The Soviets' result in the space race affected how they did in the Cold War, because since the space race was part of the Cold War, it was one example of the competitions between the two countries.
Okay. Now it's time for the open letter. Got it. I think, ladies and gentlemen, and I particularly address to those of you who have a socialist outlook, that we should at least permit this social economy to prove its superiority. Let's allow it to show that it is advanced, that it is omnipotent, that it has defeated you, that it has overtaken you. Let us not interfere with it.
Let us stop selling it and to give it loans. If it is all-powerful, then let it stand on its own feet for 10 or 15 years. Then we will see what it looks like. I can tell you what it will look like. I am being quite serious now, when the Soviet economy will no longer be able to deal with everything. It will have to reduce its military preparations.
It will have to abandon the useless space effort, and it will have to feed and clothe its own people, and the system will be forced to relax. Thus, all I ask of you is that as long as the Soviet economy is so proud, so flourishing, and yours is so rotten and so morbid, stop helping it. When has the crippled ever helped along an athlete? Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This quote speaks about how the space race affected Germany's economy so badly that they had to almost rebuild the entire structure of it after. Throughout the space race, America's economy was not able to stand and was struggling until they were able to pull it together and get a couple of astronauts to touch down on the moon. After this event, America's economy began to look up, as they had established a new reputation. But the Soviet Unions began to go downhill. For most of the space race, the Soviet Union had been ahead, learning techniques to help them reach new levels of what we thought to be the furthest they could go. But when they lost the space race, the Soviets' economy began to fall, and 20 years later, the Berlin Wall came down and ended the Cold War.
It's time to put everything together. A lot of labor forces and money was put into the space race for the United States and the Soviet Union. It pushed the decline in the economy for both countries at a visible speed.
So the space race seems like a political war, and it does cause for the Soviet Union's failure in the Cold War. But there's no doubt that it's a huge step for the human astronomical career. The disintegration of the Soviet Union ended the space race, but its aftermath is just like what Neil Armstrong said in space. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're done!